and welcome to the newest episode of the Read Right to Left podcast. I, as always, am G, joined by my wonderful co-host, Ray, from Whimsical Pictures.
Hi, everybody.
And this month we are doing a series spotlight, a fantastic josei drama series called Descending Stories by Haruko Kumota. It has a very beloved cult favorite anime from a couple years ago, and so I think this month we're going to be diving right in, no questions, so we'll just get into it.
Yep. So the full title of this is Descending Stories Showa Genroku Rakugo Shinjuu. Showa Genroku is like two eras in the 20th century of Japanese history, and Rakugo is the art form that this series is about. Shinjuu means double suicide, so it's a sort of a title that encompasses a lot, I think. But so first of all, Rakugo. What is Rakugo? The word literally, when literally translated, the two characters in it do mean descending stories. And this is the traditional Japanese performing art of comedic storytelling. If you wanted to compare it to something in the West, it could be most easily compared to like stand-up comedy, in that there's like a single performer who is telling a set to an audience, largely like trying to use their charisma and their comedic chops to, you know, give the audience a good laugh. But that's kind of where the similarities end. The major difference here, there's a lot of differences, but the major one is that as opposed to a stand-up comedian like building their own set, writing their own jokes, Rakugo has, as the Descending Stories name implies, a set canon of stories that have been passed down through oral tradition through the generations, and performers will memorize those stories and work to perfect their telling of them. And a Rakugo set will typically consist of like 2 or 3 of these stories. Yeah. If you only watched the anime, you especially, because I think that like the author's notes in the backs of the volumes here give a lot of like relevant context for where Rakugo is at as an art form now, because Haruko Kumota is very passionate about Rakugo and getting other people to engage with Rakugo. So it's a lot of guides for like how to go see Rakugo, where to see it, when to see it, how to find a favorite, you know, like how to enjoy Rakugo, that kind of thing. But I guess one thing that you only see like coming up right at the end of the series is that like if you go to see Rakugo now, you are much more likely to see like a female Rakugo artist. That's not really like an unusual thing or anything. And you are quite likely to hear original stories that are still using that sort of oral tradition, the set like story conventions, writing conventions, and character conventions, but are original stories that often take place in modern times with modern versions of those stock characters. So that's quite common as well. Even like sets that include like a classic story and then an original story is, you know, pretty normal these days.
So when you compare that to kind of the manga series itself, and I, as someone kind of completely outside of this art form, this culture, and also this time frame, I don't know how accurately it portrays Rakugo in the Showa period. I'm sure closer than not, but a lot of, in what you've said, right, of like the modernity of female performers, original stories is not, it's something that is a big aspect of the series itself, but part of this kind of reconstruction and change of Rakugo from Showa to kind of the quote-unquote modern era, and passing it from the masters of old to, you know, something that, you know, the younger people, less traditional Japanese society would be interested in, especially as I'm sure our listeners are very aware, Showa was a huge period of change for Japan.
Yeah, I mean, it was
decades,
long.
Right? It was very long. In that time, you know, the introduction of radio, television, Japan was in and lost a war. Like the idea of, you know, entertainment becoming this very high-paced, less personal connection with an audience. There's a little bit more of a disconnect, because obviously if you're watching something on television versus watching a live performance, there's a lot of change there in just how people sought their entertainment, which is one of the major themes within this series. So as you said, the Rakugo of today is, in, you know, 2022 is very different from the Rakugo of the Showa period, but is also very different of the Rakugo portrayed within this series as during that change, like during the shift of like from a male only entertainment to an audience of locals who came to see a particular person hear a particular story. But in saying that, you know, live entertainment, comedic or otherwise, and again, it's something that comes up a lot in this series about the connection to the audience, and how despite our main character really wanting to kind of usher in the end of Rakugo for majority of the series, kind of the futility of that because of what Rakugo represents, being connections between people, storytellers, you know, generationally, audiences generationally. There, you truly can't like end an art form with one person or with the loss of a single individual.
Before we go deeper into some of those themes of the series, would you like to give a quick synopsis of what the series is about and sort of our main players?
Yes. So this series, Descending Stories, there's a couple main characters running around, but our main protagonist is Yakumo Yurakutei VIII.
Yeah.
Also, yeah. The eighth. So he's taken on this mantle, the Yakumo mantle, from his master previously. His name before that is Kikuhiko. And then prior to that, he was just called Bon.
Yeah, we don't know what his name was before he became an artist.
We don't know his actual legal birth name. So we have multiple pseudonyms for this individual, which comes into play quite strongly throughout the story as well. So we have this, when we meet him at the beginning of the story, he is kind of an older master. He is very representative of the last bastion of Showa Rakugo, or Rakugo within the Showa period.
He's like the last great master, because he is at that point like the president of the Rakugo Association. Like he's very much like in the peak of his career. Like he is, the master artist, as it were, archetypally.
Yes. Yeah, so he is very representative of the art form at that period, and had been for a long time. Our other main character, well, multiple main characters, our other main character who interacts with the story mostly is Yotaro, who becomes Yakumo's apprentice, a student. He, after leaving prison, decides to become a Rakugo performer after hearing Yakumo give a Rakugo performance at the prison. But personality-wise, they are very, very different. He is the only student that Yakumo has ever taken in the course of his career. And so through, I don't know, just sheer force of
will,
spunk, he manages to join.
So Yotaro, like, he leaves prison, and he's seen this Rakugo performance from Yakumo while he was there, and it changed his life, changed his outlook on life. He was like, I'm gonna be Yakumo's apprentice, and he's not quite sure how he's gonna get to Yakumo, but luckily fate has decided to do him a solid, and he just literally runs right into Yakumo and prostrates himself and asks to be his apprentice. And Yakumo, who at this point is a bitter, cynical, cold, old man, who has grown a bit capricious in his old age, I would say. You know what? He doesn't know what's come over him, but he decides to take in this kid as an apprentice, sort of, like, ironically. And calls him Yotaro, which is one of the stock characters in Rakugo, which is like the idiot character, and it really fits him to a T. And yeah.
Exactly. Yes, so once Yotaro joins, in this household, starts training as a Rakugo performer, he soon learns about, there's a young woman who's living with Yakumo called Konatsu, who is the daughter of two friends of Yakumo's who have passed away, sadly, several decades before. And so Konatsu's a very major character. She's kind of representative of a lot of the change happening as well. But of course, the other two main characters were her parents, that being Sukeroku, who was Yakumo's kind of lifelong rival, brother in arms almost. They both trained under the same master. They started the same day. They come from very different backgrounds, and they have very different personalities.
And very different styles of Rakugo as well.
Yes, but they seem to always be drawn together in like a fateful way. They represent parts of what's missing from the other person, and in that way they continue to just be each other's support system.
And Yakumo continues to be haunted by Sukeroku's ghost after his death.
Yeah, and finally is Miyokichi, who is also Konatsu's mother. She's an interesting woman.
Perhaps the most contentious aspect of this series.
Yes. She was a geisha and formerly, had feelings for Yakumo, ran away with Sukeroku, and obviously had his child. She's very interesting, and I'm sure we'll talk a little bit about her going forward. But again, she's someone from Yakumo's past who he's haunted by, and kind of what she represents, and the guilt that he feels about being the sole survivor of this generation of people. So yeah, those are most of the main characters. We have a couple others running around, but those are the ones that matter.
Yeah. We'll mention the other ones if they come up.
Over the course of the series, we're following Yakumo and his relationship with Rakugo, his early life, his relationship with Sukeroku and Konatsu and Yotaro, pretty much from like 7 or 8 years old up into, spoilers, his death. And it's such an interesting piece about the role of the performer and being an artist and what your art represents and how much you put into it, which is, again, kind of this, we touched on it, the difference in Rakugo performers and their styles and how they perform on stage and what that means to them. And for Yakumo, it's become this real love-hate relationship, almost this toxicity that he can't not have Rakugo in his life. He wasn't initially that infatuated with Rakugo, but it's become so much of a part of him that he can't imagine not being a Rakugo performer, and which is why it prompts him to want to kind of cling to it and be the end of it, because he doesn't see a lot of potential and change for the future with it.
There's a couple different double suicides in this series, but one of them is like literal Rakugo Shinjuu, because Yakumo himself has this desire to commit a lover's suicide with his art and to die with the art form itself, carry it with him into the afterlife so no one else can have it.
Because of that, it shapes a lot of how he interacts with people. Obviously, Yotaro and Konatsu, but kind of the wider Rakugo community as well. And then also with his past and how he reflects on the art form and the changing world. And so much so that he's kind of become blind to the potential that it has, because he is so mired in what Rakugo was. Up until a point, he doesn't have a lot of perspective on what it can be. And again, that's very much in line with kind of the changing of the generations and how art changes and transforms over the eras, and which is kind of perfectly reflected in what Rakugo is and how stories do change and adjust and, you know, disappear and reappear throughout the eras.
I think this one of this manga's like biggest accomplishments is that it's like just such a fantastic work of character writing. Like Yakumo as a character is just so like fully realized throughout his entire life up until his death. It's a kind of writing that you very rarely see in manga, and certainly even more rarely see done well. It's very literary in its aspirations, which I think is quite interesting. With that, I wonder if we want to go into sort of the flashback that takes up a good chunk of the early volumes of this series, which is told by Yakumo. It is a story being told by Yakumo to Yotaro, and Konatsu, I think, is listening in as well. He's not necessarily an entirely reliable narrator, as we'll find out much later. Yeah, so this covers basically his life up until where he is, like, within the present timeline of the series, when he's taken in Yotaro. Konatsu is in her 20s, you know. It starts with him as a child.
From the very beginning, the reason that Yakumo even started Rakugo was because he was sent to who would become his master, his teacher, at a very early age after he got a leg injury. I don't know if he was born disabled or if he just got into an accident and developed an injury. But his family, or his mother, presumably, was a geisha, and there's not really room for, one, boys, but also people who can't
dance,
perform geisha duties, dance.
Yeah. He had been taught to dance. There are roles within geisha performances that can be performed by children of any gender, but he'd kind of reached the age where he'd sort of outlived his usefulness there, and he also got a leg injury that coincided with that. So, convenient reason to throw him out.
He ends up at the home of this Rakugo performer master.
Yakumo the
Seventh. His will. Yakumo the Seventh. And as he's about to be dumped at this place, another scruffy little street kid runs ahead of him and says, I'm coming too, we're doing this. Because who becomes Sukeroku, he really just loves Rakugo and wants to be a Rakugo performer. Doesn't seem to have any family, and at first their teacher really isn't interested in taking on another kid. His wife isn't happy that they're taking on one kid anyway, so two kids. But ultimately he does decide to take on both boys and train them as Rakugo performers. Despite them coming from very different backgrounds, with very different personalities and very different performance styles and very different ideas and relationships with Rakugo, they very quickly become these kind of acrimonious friends. That friend that you have that's like a pain in the ass, but you love them anyway.
Yeah.
So Yakumo never really approves of Sukeroku's behavior, especially. Not approves, but he doesn't truly understand him or could be as free, quote unquote, as him.
Yeah. Well, he also doesn't approve of his behavior.
Well, exactly. But the two of them, despite all the odds, they train together, they grow up together, and even when they go their separate ways, as they continue to rise in the ranks of Rakugo, they still end up kind of falling into each other and supporting each other, whether that be through their art or financially, which is normally what Kiku's doing for Sukeroku.
Which is, we have an interesting reversal of fates going on there, where Sukeroku being much more outgoing, much more of a crowd pleaser, much more just popular, with the ladies and everyone else. Much more, I guess, he's got that it factor, right? He's got this inherent star power that makes everyone turn towards him like a magnet, which leads him to sort of rise in the ranks and find a voice for himself within Rakugo much earlier than Kikuhiko does. And we see Kiku, who very much during a lot of the early part of his life resents Rakugo as this thing that he's sort of been imprisoned in. He has to do it. He's been abandoned, and so this is the only thing left to him. So he's got this resentment towards the art that he's trying to refine, and also he just doesn't have those qualities that Sukeroku does. He's quiet and reserved and thoughtful and timid. So it takes him a very long time to find what Rakugo means to him, and thus what his performance style even is. He feels like he has to be someone like Sukeroku or any of the other great Rakugo performers that he's looking at, who are much more outgoing, much more outwardly funny. And so in trying to be like them, he's just doing some really horrible Rakugo because he's just not that person.
That's just not his personality. He's not the guy.
Yeah, which, we know because we've seen him in his old age once he's perfected his craft, and he's very funny, but he's funny in like a sly fox kind of way. But it's like by turns, it's like we see that at first Sukeroku has all of the good luck, as it would seem, that he's, making the biggest strides forward. But he also crashes and burns very early on. A lot of like his kind of upbringing or lack thereof comes back to bite him. He, puts too much of himself into his craft and into all the people who come to the theater. And he ends up, becoming an alcoholic. He ends up becoming a deadbeat, like spending all his time in the geisha quarters, like really only showing up to Kiku's place when he needs a bill paid. So, and, by that point we can see Kiku, like, starting to find his footing because he's sort of, first of all, he's gaining the benefits of being the good son when the prodigal son has left the nest. But he's also just been quietly following tradition for a lot of years, and his master likes that because he doesn't want Rakugo to change, and he sees that Sukeroku represents a kind of change that is just thoroughly different from everything that he believes that Rakugo is, and so he puts all of his faith into Kiku instead. And we see that sort of reversal of fortune. When Sukeroku seems like he has everything, Kiku has nothing. And when Kiku has everything, Sukeroku has nothing.
And it's so hard for them to kind of coexist at the same level at the same time.
It's almost like they can't. Like, there's so much in direct opposition to each other. And I mean, the two of them do represent two different perspectives on Rakugo, right? Where Sukeroku is all about, making his art accessible to the people and allowing the art form to change with the times, even if that means, like, original stories, if that means, letting go of some of the more highbrow, if you would say, like, intellectual aspirations of the art form.
Yeah.
Whereas Yakumo, Kikuhiko at this point in his life, represents the traditions, the old ways, this refusal to change with the times, this refusal to acknowledge the audience as active participants in the art form. Sukeroku is very much like, my Rakugo is nothing without them. Whereas Kikuhiko's entire thing is that he feels he can only truly be himself when he's doing Rakugo. And, whether there are other people in the room, be damned. Like, he couldn't care less.
Rakugo is how he expresses himself as a person. And there's no engagement to an audience in his mind, aside from, like, well, that's the expected. You want your audience to like you.
Yeah. If they're engaged with his art, it means they're engaged with him as a person. And that's validating to him as someone who sometimes has a shaky sense of self, which I'm sure we'll get into. And so we see, like, that opposition between artist and audience, like, who should be prioritized, and as well as that opposition between tradition and modernity, between sticking to the old ways and adapting to the new. And we see consistently that these two, if one of them is doing well, the other one is not. They are in direct opposition, and they cannot both succeed, which we don't really see a resolution to until we get into the next generation of characters.
Before we kind of transition to the next generation of characters, I wanted to note that this rivalry, this kind of incapability to coexist is almost highlighted by Miyokichi and her relationship with these two men, wherein she she herself is a very complicated person who, through circumstance and decision, has ended up with a string of bad relationships, and she jumps from one to the other, in an attempt to find someone to accept her and understand her. And so her feelings are very all over the place in regards to both of them. There's an idea there that she loves, like, the person she truly loves or she sees herself most in is Kiku, Yakumo. Her attraction to him as kind of being a part of her and being the one person that fully understands her is quite important to her, but her relationship with Sukeroku being kind of that disconnect from who she is and that escape from what she thinks of herself as, which has its issues because she runs away from that relationship as well.
There's this aspect there as well of, like, Sukeroku is very attainable to her because he's immediately attracted to her, and, like, DTF, frankly. Whereas she dates Kikuhiko for a long time, and, like, he is just not emotionally there at all.
Yeah.
He's too into his art. He's too into Sukeroku. And he's just also a very closed off and emotionally distant person. And for her, I think that her claiming she sees so much in Kikuhiko is almost like a reflection of the pedestal she's put him on because she sees him as unattainable, as well as, like, a reflection of, like, her own self-loathing in a way. You know, she's learned to sort of mold herself to be desirable to any man, but she can't figure out how to be desirable to this man, kind of is...
Yeah, the person that she's most curious about or most interested in.
Or, you know, ends up mistaking that lack of interest as him understanding her on a deeper level. Which I don't necessarily think, like, since we're spending this whole story in Kiku's point of view, I don't think is necessarily the case. Like, he's mostly just baffled and bewildered by her existence. So, and he cares about her, sure, but he himself can't really quantify how he cares about her.
There's an aspect of the love that he has, because he cares about her and he does love her on a level, but not in a romantic sense. And again, I think their relationship is very fraught because they do recognize kind of their own loneliness and lack within each other, to a pretty unstable point, and wherein Kiku, aka Yakumo, has found a way to try and express himself through Rakugo, and through, like, being himself through how he tells his stories. Miyakichi doesn't have that except for her relationship to men. So she doesn't have that self-expression that is purely just for herself, which is something that she's been struggling with from day one. We know that she and Sukeroku and Yakumo VII met in Manchuria, and who can, you know, there's a lot of aspects to that as well.
She'd already had a relationship with Yakumo VII for a while.
But even prior to that was she followed a man to Manchuria, right, and then was abandoned by him there. So it's, you know, she's chasing after someone to give her purpose, and to tell her, like, this is who you are, or, like, it's okay for you to be this person, for someone to accept her, right? And over the course of the story, Sukeroku kind of is that person, and Yakumo, like, or Kiku recognizes like that the three of them can be each other's support system, but also like they very obviously represent different relationships to each other. Whereas Miyokichi, I think she has trouble coordinating between the different types of love, like how to interact with people, especially like men.
Yeah. So we see repeatedly this motif of like her only knowing how to define herself by her relationship to men. And we also see a series of men who don't know how to quantify a woman except in terms of like property and like an object or a reflection of them more than anything. We see this from Yakumo VII, who like is a geezer by the time we meet him, right?
Yeah.
So he has very old-fashioned ideas about women. He warns Sukeroku and Kiku not to get too close to her. Like, you know, a girl like that is fun for a fling, but don't get any emotions involved because she's going to be your ruin. And Kiku, like, hears this from him and recognizes that it's kind of hoary and old, right? But by the same token, later on, when he's asked, you know, why women can't do Rakugo, he says, women belong in the audiences because they motivate men to do the best art of their lives. When a man sees a beautiful woman in the audience, he's motivated to become an even greater artist and reach for even greater heights. That's where a woman belongs. So the only person we really don't see treating Miyokichi like a vessel for his own shit is Sukeroku, the one who so much like prioritizes the audience that he loses himself in the mix. And he's frankly just a mess.
I mean, you made the point that Sukeroku, he loses himself in his audience, so much so that, you know, once he loses his access to Rakugo, once he gets kind of kicked out, he loses himself. He becomes this bum where, I mean, he wasn't super responsible or wonderful prior to this, but he completely loses all motivation. He doesn't want to work. All he does is stay at home and drink all day.
We also see like Miyokichi denying him from performing Rakugo even in like local capacities. And even when he was still active, she would be like, I can't believe you're doing that stuff. That's not a real job. And it's like, this is like conjecture on my part, but I think like following the whole idea that she has no vessel for self-expression in this era besides her relationships with men. You know, perhaps she resents her husband for having that vehicle for self-expression when she cannot, and that she can't be that vessel for his self-expression.
That he doesn't find himself in her in the same way that she finds herself in him or in whomever man that she is with, or the version of herself that she wants to be. It's a very complicated relationship. And during this part of the story wherein we're hearing about their relationship and their untimely death from Yakumo, this is where the unreliable narration comes in how they ended up dying in a horrible accident, which is true, but because of how he tells it, because of how he presents it, and in order to protect the people he cares about the most, both Sukeroku, Miyokichi, and Konatsu as well, he takes on the entirety of the guilt. So when we learn about the realities of this whole situation, what happened, why it happened, it's a lot more complicated and a lot more focused on Konatsu, which he's been protecting her from her whole life and which she doesn't remember, and which has been foundational to her quote-unquote hatred of him. She doesn't like him. They've never gotten on because of her misunderstanding of the situation, but also, well, they again, there's a very contentious relationship. They care about each other. They don't exactly like each other, but they need the other person to be there. Mm-hmm. Again, in a way that, well, it is love, right? Like, mm-hmm. It's a familial love. They care about each other deeply, but they're both very hurt and broken people.
They're also both stubborn gits. Don't forget that.
Well, yes, that too. None of these people are very good communicators for being storytelling. They're like one functional thing that they do.
Except Yotaro.
Yotaro.
Nothing if not a good communicator. Too good, honestly. But speaking of Konatsu, you may have gathered, dear listener, that this series operates in a lot of dualities between characters. And there is very much a duality between Miyokichi and Konatsu as the two sort of main female presences within the series. There's a couple other side characters, but overall it is a very male-centric series and male-centric art form at this time. So a lot of what we see reflected in that duality is how Konatsu, who is also a very strong-willed woman, and very clever in ways that aren't, dissimilar from her mother. But we see her grow into a much more headstrong young woman. We see more doors open for her. We see, even though, Yakumo has his moments of old man sexism, at the end of the day, what he says to her most often is do as you please. Yotaro, the man who she ends up with, is just, as much as we've dropped this word, just an absolute wife guy. So even when she does end up sort of making some similar mistakes to her mother, her responses to those mistakes, the choices that she makes in response to them, and the ways that people around her respond to her responses is different because the era has changed. So, we see Konatsu's story ending very differently than Miyokichi's, largely because of the inexorable flow of time, which is something.
It is, and I think also Konatsu recognizes she has such a fear as well of becoming like her mother, because for as much as she, claims she hates Yakumo and blames him for her parents' death and wants to kill him, she also recognizes that, especially her mother, was not wholly innocent in what happened and why the situation got to the point that it was. And she recognizes in certain points in her life herself falling down similar patterns and wanting to proactively make that change. And as you said, right, due to just the people around her, the era, she had a much different experience compared to her mother, and therefore her life ended up in a much more different place than either of her parents, just due to the fact that, time moves ever forward, and she had relationships in her life that neither of her parents did. And even so much so from the person that was in all three of their lives, right? Yakumo represented a very different person to all three of them.
Yeah, he's been a very different person over the years. He's as awful as he is to as awful as he is to Konatsu, from time to time, he has gotten softer in his old age, and we do see him sort of being very warm to her at times. Even as we know that they haven't had a great time together.
They haven't had a great time together, but I don't think there's ever a doubt that he cared about her, even in just so far as like what she represented, right? Mm-hmm. Like their relationship might not have been amicable for a lot of it. And it took a long time for them to be, you know, to kind of sort through and talk about some things that they'd gone through. But like if he really didn't care, he would have never taken her in, right? Mm-hmm. Like aside, there's a level of like, okay, it's duty. You know, you care for the people that...
Yeah. Do you just leave the little girl in the gutter?
Yeah, exactly. Like there's a duty element to it, but by the time, like, he wouldn't stay in her life or have her in his life as an adult. He's always had the open door for her, even if he doesn't agree with her choices and what she wants to do. And which is solidified, and their relationship, I don't want to say healed, because that's not really the right word, but their relationship helped along by Yotaro and his introduction to their relationship dynamic as well, being the third person or third/fourth person in this weird little family. Yeah. Because we can't forget Matsuda.
We can't forget Matsuda. Matsuda. The one who really raised Konatsu, according to Yakumo himself.
Matsuda-san.
The most wonderful old man. So Matsuda is Yakumo's driver and household attendant. And they've been together
and he was the former Yakumo's.
Yeah. So they know
forever.
They've been together forever. But before we get fully into sort of the latter timeline of this series, I did want to quickly touch on a rather common reading of the series and the secret third female main character of the series. Yeah, it's really quite common to read Yakumo VIII as a trans woman. At the very least, as a gay man, and probably as a trans woman as well. It's a reading that, like, I definitely was quite fond of watching the anime, and I think that the manga pushes it even more. So, and I mean, people will be like, there's nothing in this to support this. Like, why wouldn't it be heterosexual by default? And I'm like, this is the first non-explicitly BL work that Kumota Haruko has ever written. And to date, still her only one.
Yeah.
And, like, her BL is gender as fuck. Like, if you read any of it. So, like, her writing a trans or genderqueer protagonist and her writing BL elements into her work is the default, people. But anyway, so part of what we were talking about with Yakumo feeling that Rakugo for him is self-expression. Specifically how he realized this was, like, first Skeiroku got him to put on this, like, play with him and a bunch of the apprentices where he was playing I think a male character, but who is, like, who cross-dresses. Pretending to be a lady. In the way that, like, Kami do, you know? So, he feels so empowered getting up on that stage and realizing that the people in the audience are seeing him as this beautiful, powerful woman, that he is entrancing, that he is bewitching. And from that point on, he realizes that he's really good at doing female characters in Rakugo.
Oh, absolutely.
That is what he's known for. His women, there is bread and butter. They are complex. They are sexy. They are... He just really gets into their hearts, man, in a way that just, like, other Rakugo artists just don't. And also, like, right after this, we see him having like his first Rakugo performance after this epiphany that he had on stage during this play. And he's playing a particularly famous female character. Mm-hmm. And that is when he realizes, this is what Rakugo is for me. This is me expressing myself in a way that I can't outside of Rakugo. Mm-hmm. And it's like, wow, that's the transest thing I've ever heard in my life. And then, like, Miyokichi, when she's dating him, like, multiple times literally asks him, like, are you even into women?
Yeah. Well, also, like, their relationship is so much him, through her, having, like, a relationship with his female expression, right? Like, he bases so much of his women, on her. Himself, on her. And, like, so much so that she's doing his makeup. They are just hanging out in her room, not doing anything, right? Like, if it's Sukeroku, he's you know, down. But Kiku doesn't want that. He's there to observe.
He'll try to, like, act the part, too, but Miyokichi's like, when he never comes to kiss me, and when I kiss him, he doesn't seem to like it. And, like when we are with each other, we just chat. And he's so obsessed with Sukeroku, to the exclusion of me, which we often see, like, Kiku in the background of Sukeroku doing whatever, just, like, blushing with his entire face. Like, he is enthralled by Sukeroku in a way that Sukeroku, despite also seeing Kiku as this, like, great rival, as this brother in arms, just never seems to reciprocate.
Sukeroku is extremely het, like, so much so. It's completely off of his radar to even think of Kiku in a way that, like, is anything like, oh yeah, he's my, you know, again, brother in arms. We're just two dudes being pals. Meanwhile, Miyokichi, like, asks Sukeroku, like, does he even like women? Because she's gotten sick of asking Kiku to his face, I guess. Yeah.
And Sukeroku's like, of course he likes women. Women are great.
Women are wonderful. And it's like, well... what Rakugo artist doesn't love women? And you're like, well...
Well...
There's loving women... And then there's loving women insofar as, like, you want to be a woman.
You just, like, are a woman, and you love men as a woman. And you are in a relationship with another woman who also loves men as a woman.
Or even, again, and I also agree that I think it's a very valid reading and very obvious as to, like, the trans reading of Yakumo Kikuhiko. But even if you don't subscribe to that, it would be just absolutely impossible to read him as, like, heterosexual in any way. Because regardless of whether he wants to actually be a woman insofar as he identifies as a woman in the ways that he can within, like, the Showa period and society and this very traditionalist structure and industry that he's in, or he wants to be a woman insofar as, like, the freedoms that women have to be in relationships with men, and their self-expression. Either way, right? Like, this is not a man who's like, I definitely want a wife and 3 children at home.
Yeah.
This is...
I'm gonna spend all my nights in the geisha quarters, and I am utterly secure in my masculinity at all times. So there's that. And I think that that very much like plays into um sort of his rigidity as a character, in that
Mm-hmm.
like we see him grow into a very bitter and cynical old man who's just
Mm-hmm.
clinging to the old ways for dear life, and
Mm-hmm.
doesn't want his art to change. He would rather kill it himself with his
Mm-hmm.
own hands than and then die himself than watch it change. And
Mm-hmm.
I think that that gains like a lot of layers when you add to it the idea that, you know, whether you interpret him as just queer or possibly trans, that, you know, a lot of that same sort of stubbornness, a lot of that same just like larger societal lack of imagination, lack of realization that these people exist, lack of willingness to realize that these people exist. Well,
Mm-hmm.
I'm not wording this like as well as I want to, but like that definitely like you can see that as well reflected in his sort of inherent tragedy as a character, and the fact that he never really, there are ways in which he never really ends up fulfilled.
He's a product. He's a product of his era, right?
Mm-hmm.
In all sorts of ways, and
Mm-hmm.
ultimately becomes a representative of that era. Kind of, well, for the art form, but also for, Showa as it is. He grew up within a society that was very much a certain way, but that was also kind of the pinnacle of change, right? And
From the very start, he, like the first scene that we see him in as a little boy is him being cast aside for his gender and place of birth,
mm-hmm,
as well as
mm-hmm,
his disability. And that's in the Taisho era, right?
mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
So we see this sort of lack of resources that's sort of restricting of what he's able to do and what he's able to accomplish. I mean, Rakugo is set out for him as his course.
mm-hmm.
And he doesn't really have any freedom to deviate from that, and he resents that for like half his life. So, like, even from the very first scene where we're introduced to him through to the very last scene, it's like this thematically carries through all the way.
Mm-hmm. In so much so, in saying like he's a product of his time in a different era. If he was born, within the younger generation, his life could have and would have probably gone in a completely different trajectory. As we all are like product of our situation and of the society and time that we are born into. The fact that he does cling to tradition and the rigid structure of what he's been forcibly brought up into is just further to that point, right? Like it's just a continuation of he's been rejected so much throughout his life. And so when Rakugo starts to change, that becomes something like he doesn't want to be rejected by something he's become familiar with and that
Mm.
he's come to see as representative of himself,
Mm-hmm.
which obviously brings that whole relationship to the art form and to again this changing society, the bubble era of Japan, and that like completely switching how audiences engage with media.
Yeah.
It's something that he has clung to as a way to protect himself in a society and in an industry that otherwise would reject him, and even from people, right, like Sukaroku and Miyokichi. I don't inherently think they would reject him, but I don't think that he knows that they wouldn't reject him, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
his
And
level
certainly
of
they wouldn't understand.
Exactly. His level of understanding of their relationship is very different from their perspective of it as well.
In terms of another duality, like, we see with that sort of the old stories, the old set canon of Rakugo stories that for Yakumo has come to represent himself, we see that sort of flipped on its head in Konatsu, who, because all of the stories are from a male perspective inherently, like, as the speaker, she literally is completely barred from doing Rakugo at all, with the stories as they are. So we see sort of Yakumo, who sees himself in these stories because that's how a place that he's come to after decades. But we also have somebody who, because she's a woman, is just barred from entry at the start because all of these stories are about male storytellers using masculine Japanese. And so for her, she'll only find freedom within the medium if the stories are changed, which is heretical to Yakumo.
Yeah, absolutely. And the adaptability and the need for art to change over the years, and especially when we're talking about like traditional arts, how easily things can be lost if there's no one to continue that chain of artistic expression, especially for something like, live storytelling. It is something that, without having adapted to a more modern audience, I'm not saying would have disappeared. Of course it wouldn't have, but it certainly would have a lot harder time existing in this, especially now, like this 2020 era of like, oh, we've got social media everywhere, and then we've got like television, the internet, radio, all of these things competing for our attention, that without kind of meeting the audience where they're at, without completely rejecting what the art form is in of itself, is how you maintain those sorts of things. And the good thing about art is that, it is able to change. It is able to adapt to what it needs to be to continue its relevancy.
Yeah. And I mean, this, of course, does come up in the series, as you've mentioned. But specifically with Yakumo's character, it's something that he has to confront very directly. There's a major character in the latter half of the series who is an author called Higuchi, who he's an academic, and he does have like a bit of history with Yakumo in that one time he asked to be his apprentice and Yakumo was like, fuck no. But the main thing here is that Higuchi, he is a Yakumo VIII stan, loves him so much, has devoted his entire academic life to this man's Rakugo, and his thing that he wants to do is get all of Yakumo's performances recorded and also write a biography. But of course, to like record his performances, he needs the man himself's permission. So there's a lot of like different conversations where he's just trying to convince Yakumo to let him record him. If you've ever tried to talk to like a musical theater person about pro shots, can often be a long and pointless conversation. But eventually we do come to a point where Yakumo sort of, is very much coming to a point where he feels his age, where he's, having health problems and stuff and starting to feel his own mortality, I think. And he does eventually agree to have his life's work recorded for posterity and, like, now, his Rakugo is immortal. He'll die, but it won't. And that's, also an interesting discussion that the series is having about sort of the importance of maintaining an archive for art, now that we have the ability. We also they find a sole video recording of Sukeroku from when he was alive, and we see how incredibly emotionally important this is for Konatsu and Yotaro and Matsuda.
Rakugo has this bank of stories, or this history of very specific stories told. So it's not so much the content that is, I don't want to say interesting, but that's more so the interest is in the performance that the performer gives, right? And so every Rakugo performer has their own style, has their own way that they present stories. So you can listen to the same story, a dozen times from a dozen different people and have a different experience every single time. Which is why, that question of building up an archive of the masters or just even the performers of this craft is so important, and something that wasn't able to be done, right, prior to this story starting, and is something that has only now become more readily available through recording devices, whether that's, audio or video. So within this changing world, the idea of Rakugo persisting not only through the stories themselves, but Rakugo persisting through the performances of people past and present and future is a lot more interesting for the art form. And no sooner does that become very evident to Yakumo, but when he is kind of faced with his own mortality, but also the acceptance or the realization of, despite having kind of wanted his life to end for a long time, in his older age not being ready for his life to end, right? The realization that he doesn't want things to finish with him, that he doesn't actually want to commit double suicide with Rakugo, and that he wants to be there to experience the future and the change that is happening within this community and this art form that he's existed in for, the last 70 years.
Yeah, and we have this beautiful moment when he's on his deathbed, and it's just this quiet moment with Konatsu and Shinnosuke, who is Konatsu's son, where, he realizes that, all these years he's spent trying to convince himself he's utterly alone. But the whole time, he's been so tied to other people, and he's got these relationships that mean something to him, that are important to him, and that he's leaving behind. And that there are people who are going to remember him when he's gone. And that there are people waiting for him in the afterlife, which he does meet them in the afterlife.
And I cried like a little baby.
Yes, and it's this beautiful sort of reflection of how this art form that he has been seeing as an expression of himself as an individual for so long, how it is so utterly about human beings connecting with each other, whether that be between the performer and the audience within the room, or between the writer of the initial story and the people living today, or between the apprentice and his master who's passed on. That this is all about bonds between people across space and across time. And I just think that that's such a beautiful message about what art is and what it means. And what life is and what life means,
What it means to be a person, what it means to be connected to your community and the people around you in all sorts of capacities.
Yeah. So much of stories about art and artists relies so much on this idea of the artistic savant who cannot possibly be understood by mere mortals, who sequesters himself off.
The solitary genius, right?
The solitary genius. The master in his workshop, right?
No one could ever understand.
That to be an artist is to be alone. That to be an artist is to have your work be misunderstood by the masses, you know? Whereas I really appreciate this manga and this anime, this franchise, I guess, for providing a counterpoint to that. That's like, art isn't just the creator's vision for the work, and it isn't just the audience's vision for the work. Art is a connection. Art is a conversation. And not just between, you know, speaker and listener, but between generations, between societies, between every member of an audience in a room. That art can't be reduced to one or two people, because art, to some extent, is humanity itself. I really,
Well, it's a reflection. Art is a reflection of humanity and of the era and of what... I mean, art is the zeitgeist, right? Like, it reflects so perfectly what humanity and what society and what countries, geopolitically or otherwise, are doing, what it means to be human in, you know, year XYZ. And to be able to look at that in the future and see that so clearly reflected, and then also recognize like the universality of like the human experience is just so incredibly personal and so incredibly beautifully done within this particular series. And further to that point, like, to go on a little bit of a soapbox here, but like manga is the perfect example of this, of like people think of it as being like a single person's work, but we know even like the most popular dedicated mangaka does still have a team around them of assistants, of editors, of whoever it is. Like, no art is made in a vacuum, right? Art in itself, manga in itself, is a collaboration of ideas and people and perspectives that, like, yes, you know, you might have one person's name on the front cover, but there's a team of people who are responsible and contributing to this, what is the final product, and what the audience, what the viewers, what the, you know, experience is in the finality. And you need those people. Again, it's so lovely to see, as you said, Ray, art and artistry, even in a somewhat unconventional art form like Rakugo, being portrayed as something that is communal, that is involving so many different people and having this connection with the wider world, and obviously this internal connection. This story wouldn't be what it is without Yakumo and without his life's progression and his perspective changing, but it also wouldn't be the same without Yotaro, without Konatsu, without Sukeroku, without Miyokichi, without anyone, right? Like, it is so many moving pieces, but they all are a perfect part to what the series is and what this series becomes over the course of it.
I just wanted to mention like one scene within the afterlife that I think just like encompasses a lot of this. Because Yakumo does, you know, he meets Sukeroku and Miyokichi in the afterlife, and it's very sweet, and I'm crying through the whole thing. And they show him that the Rakugo theater that burnt down while he was alive has shown up in the afterlife now. So before he crosses the Sanzu River, which is like the Japanese analog for the river Styx, serves a similar purpose. He has the chance to do one more performance. And so he gets up on that stage, and there's a cushion there that whoever the person performing most wants to hear their rakugo in that moment appears there for just that moment, and then they go back to their life among the living. And for Sukeroku, that is Konatsu, little baby Konatsu. And for Yakumo, it's Shinnosuke, who is Konatsu's son and his grandson. And what I thought was so sweet was that rather than, like, you would expect at this climactic moment that he would do one of the Rakugo stories that has been shown to mean the most to him, like the God of Death, or one of the other ones that he's done over and over and over again. I guess the Weathered Bones is Sugeroku's one. But, one of these sort of more dark, haunting tales, or more, like, I guess, coy, sexy tales that he's particularly good at.
Sultry tales.
Sultry. But instead, he does Jugemu, which is anybody who's seen, like, the extras to Full Metal Alchemist Brotherhood has seen the one where, like, Scar and Führer Bradley are just, like, yelling this really stupid long, like, Japanese name at each other. Like, what a coincidence! My name is also Jugemu. And that is a Rakugo story. And the way that it shows up repeatedly in this is that kids really like it. It's an easy joke to understand. There's nothing, like, untoward about it or hard to get. You don't need a history lesson for it. It's just like, look at this kid with the stupid long name. And that's the one that he performs. So he's performing to Konatsu and Shinnosuke, who are children, in this moment. And, I just think that that's a perfect place to end his Rakugo career.
Absolutely.
With the children. With the children.
New generation. The new generation, the children, but also it's a perfect counterpoint to when he was alive, and when Shinsuke, like, asked him, or he's like, oh, what do you want to hear? And he would tell, like, he'd say that story, and then once on stage, he'd just go and do, like, what he actually wanted to do. And so it's that perfect, like, growth of character of, like, okay, I need to stop being so selfish, really, right? So inwardly focused and dedicated to this Rakugo being me, and Rakugo, like, has to represent what I am. Now I'm performing for the audience that I have, and the audience that want to hear what I have to say.
It's like, rather than, like, him choosing to put a bookend on his career that is his own greatest work or his own greatest challenge in life, it's like he's choosing, rather than to have a conversation with himself and his own Rakugo, he's having a conversation with his grandson, which is just showing how valuable those human relationships were to him, and how he's realized that how valuable those human relationships were to him. There's a quote, like, I don't have the right volume with me right now. One of those near-death experiences that he has a couple of them, Um,
God damn it.
he's
Yakumo.
old, he's old. But it's like he like literally sees Miyokichi and Sukeroku and the god of death in the afterlife, but he gets yanked back by the voice of someone in his family, and he's like, once again, I keep getting pulled back by my lingering attachments. Or by my human attachments, and it's like, aww.
Yeah, no, the amount of times it's like, well, once again, I have failed because of the people who care about him
die.
are like, oh, we don't want you to die. God.
Can I just say how wonderful of an old man he is?
He's so sweet. I
just love him.
legitimately, he mellows out so much in his old age, and I think that comes with like, I don't want to say confidence, but with self-security, and like also being okay to like question or to like confront the parts of you that you were too afraid to even like think about as a young person. I just love like,
but he's still got that biting wit.
Yeah, the sassiness.
Love him. Yeah, he's so sassy. Honestly, drag queen energy. Forever and always.
Forever and always. And we've touched on it a couple times already, but the ending to the series really is like what is so powerful about it. The way that everything is so perfectly tied together. Because there's a lot of ways this series could have just like dropped the ball in the last half. And it never does. It never fumbles.
Should we mention the one sticking point that a lot of people have right at the end? I don't actually think that it's a big deal, because I don't think the series is pushing us to actually consider it seriously.
Yeah.
But rather pushing us to be like, this literally doesn't matter. The man who's asking it is a tool, and the reason we don't get an answer to the question is because it literally could not matter less. But it's the question of Shinosuke's parentage comes up. We have a pretty strong sort of assumption at this point that Yotaro's former Yakuza boss is probably the father, but that's never really confirmed or denied. Because I mean, Konatsu had, she's had some rebellious moments that have gotten her in trouble. But we have Higuchi, who is the academic who is obsessed with Yakumo, who has a tendency to say very insensitive, crude things about people, and kind of treat Yakumo as less of a human being and more of an academic curiosity from time to time. He's very much like that kind of academic, right?
Yeah.
Like nobody, some people are friends with him, but like they don't really like him.
Yeah.
He's very annoying. He just keeps showing up. But he asks a much older Konatsu, like decades after Yakumo's own death, if maybe the relationship between an adoptive father and adoptive daughter ever evolved into something more. And she refuses to answer him because it's a stupid question that doesn't matter. Shinosuke is literally a teenager now. And it almost feels like a direct, like, facing the audience and being like such an old, like, because it really runs counter to everything the series stands for.
Yeah.
Because it would be this idea that, Shinnosuke is very good at Rakugo because he contains the blood of two great Rakugo masters within him, which is against what the series is about. So I really don't think that the series is genuinely asking you to consider that point. I think it's actively asking you not to, considering who the person who asked the question is and how he got immediately blown off afterwards.
Yeah, I think you said, like, it doesn't really inherently matter, but it's also a issue that was kind of like resolved, like pretty strongly. And the idea that, like, you can only be talented because of, like, your blood, your pedigree, which
it's
also
in your blood.
like which also is like so counterintuitive to both Yakumo and Sukeroku, right? Like, they didn't come from Rakugo people, family.
No, yeah.
So it's
like the Sukeroku name continues to live on despite its lack of pedigree because of people actively rebelling against the idea that you need a pedigree to be a Rakugo artist.
Precisely.
Like, that was why Yotaro took on the name Sukeroku III at first. It's why Sukeroku took on the name Sukeroku II from, like, the bum who raised him on the street.
Exactly. And that bum was just like a guy, right? Like, when he left Rakugo, or when he was kicked out of Rakugo, he didn't have a family to go back to. He wasn't, he wasn't from some swish Rakugo family, head of household. He just was a guy. It's, yeah, for me, that last element of, like, oh, could Yakumo be the father of his quote-unquote grandson? It's like,
It's literally like Higuchi writing fan fiction in his head.
Exactly. It's I don't know why people think it's more, like, liable or reliable that this guy would have, like, that Yakumo and Konatsu would have a sexual relationship over the fact that she was rebellious and, like, got pregnant from one of her rebellious, trysts with like a not great guy. Like, we know. You can't see me. I'm waving my hands here. It's like there's so much adoration that this author has for Yakumo that he would love the idea of, like, a genetic continuation of Yakumo, that he's just so set on this idea of, like, oh, well, he never had any children, which is, like, a really sad way to look at adoption as well, but, like, he doesn't have any blood relations. So therefore, like, I need to create this blood relation that probably isn't, right? Like, and that was the point, is, like, Yakumo has a family. They're not, like, genetically, biologically related, but it doesn't matter.
Not only does Yotaro carry on the Yakumo lineage, but, like, Konatsu could after him. Like, Shinnosuke probably will because he idolizes Yakumo's Rakugo. There's the daughter as well. Like, his lineage will live on, and the name Yakumo will live on for better or for worse as well. Like, there's no question of that. It's literally just if you're weird and, like, obsessed with, like, a literal genetic bloodline. So,
which we know isn't, like, inherently what Rakugo is about. We've also, throughout the series, seen characters wherein the sons of great masters do not take upon the, the name, the generational name of their fathers. And that's okay, right? Like, it's the head disciple or head student who becomes the representative of that namesake. Yeah, it's just such a weird... I'm not surprised it's like a sticking point or like a kind of like an off-color end cap to this finale. But like, again, I think for me it's pretty clear that like this is not something to be taken seriously. It's not something that matters. It's not something that, regardless of the situation, and like also up front, I don't believe this is the case. Like, again, this is just writing fan fiction for the sake of fan fiction. Yeah. But
this kid who looks like really obviously like either of those Yakuza dudes.
Yes, either of those Yakuza dudes, plus his like actual biological grandfather, and his mom. Like, it's just, you know, I can understand why people might like make the decision of like, oh my gosh, they introduced this, therefore like it's something to worry about. But it's also like, use some critical thinking, guys. Just like, contextually, does this make any sense at all? Yeah, I don't know. I think it's a non-starter. People who want to believe that and want to criticize the series for that aspect have missed a fundamental part of this plot, and also like what that character, all of those characters represent in the story, and what family represents, right? Like, it's just sigh.
Can we talk instead about how much of a gross hipster Shinosuke grew up to be?
Oh my god, yeah. Jeez, gosh, shit, sis. You wouldn't understand. You didn't see Grandpa perform. And it's like,
yeah, he's got these big, stupid hipster glasses, and he's got the hair. Oh my god, the hair. And, like, he's sitting here, like, brooding and, like, listening to, like, Showa-era Rakugo performances.
And the thing is that, like, he's grubby teen, so he'll hopefully grow out of it. He's got some parents with strong personalities, and a sister who won't.
I say all of this with great affection.
Yeah, I mean, and again, like, what he represents as like the future of Rakugo, because he's just as infatuated with Rakugo as his family has been, both biological and otherwise. That like, it's a reassurance to the future of Rakugo, and again, that kind of like how the art form continues to change, even if he is like a snobby hipster who's like, oh, the masters of the Showa, they're so cool. You wouldn't understand, sis. You wouldn't understand. Grandpa was amazing.
Rakugo just isn't like it used to be in my grandfather's days.
Meanwhile, he's like 17 and just like the most gormless youth. Just
adorable.
But to be fair, you know, he's not that much younger than his dad would have been when he's like, I'm going to become a Rakugo performer myself. So
and he was adorable too. So
I know, what a child. Honestly, when I reread the series, because it's been a while since I'd read it, because I read it as it came out, I was introduced to it via the anime, like I think everyone who is aware of it. And Man, when I realized that Yotaro was 22 when he went to, like, when he left prison and wanted to become a Rakugo performer, I'm like, oh my god, child. Sweetheart. Oh, youth.
Baby girl. Baby girl.
Oh, sweetheart.
Speaking of which, just want to shout out Haruko Kumota's art. I have talked about her and her art before because I am a really big fan of her BL series, My Darling Kitten Hair, Itoshi no Nekoke, which that one is entirely watercolored, so it has like an extra layer. But this one also just I love her art. There's something so squishy and round and wonderful about her artwork. You just immediately want to hug every character. She clearly put all of her tastes into the older men in this series. And we live for a self-indulgent creator as well.
Honestly, Yakumo, most handsome man.
Honestly, yes. Like, adorable child, handsome young man, handsome older man.
Handsomest old man. Like, I don't know how
old man.
He keeps getting more attractive as he gets older, and I'm
like
here
a
for
fine wine.
Exactly. He is the epitome of silver fox. I don't know how
he's
does
like
that.
80.
And he puts those glasses on and you're like, damn, sir.
It's yeah. So, but yeah, I really appreciate her art. It's very lovable, inherently lovable. There's an effortlessness to it as well, a confidence behind her brush line that, I don't know, you just read it and you feel like you're in good hands. So, and I could say that about her other work as well. I think she's a fantastic artist. So,
yeah, there's a softness to how the world is, like how she constructs a scene. And the characters within and how they interact with the world, I guess. Plus also like the amount of just beautifully evocative, like the afterlife is so beautifully done. Both like the creepy side of that and also the very harmonious, peaceful end of life. It's just, it's so beautiful. It's just, I mean, I don't want to say it's art on the page, but it is, right? Like, it's art on the page, and it's done so well and complements what the story is without miring it in, because this is a very dramatic story. It could get bogged down very easily with a heavier art style or with a...
Yeah, but there's just so much warmth.
Exactly. And that's so wonderful. There's a lightness, and also like the comedy helps a bit as well. Just the way that it incorporates all of its different elements to present this story in a way that is just so overwhelmingly well done. So with so much heart, even when it is dramatic, even when it is extremely tragic, it's done with such love and care and affection for the characters and for Rakugo, right? For this art form that even when it's at kind of its lowest depths, when Yakumo is confronting his own mortality, when he is so ready to slip into death, because he feels like he deserves that, it's appropriately weighty and appropriately dramatic and appropriately heartbreaking, but it doesn't feel like overwhelmingly negative or upsetting, or I don't want to say nihilistic, but it doesn't feel the same as, like, for example, a Inuyasha series, right? Like, it's not that same style, even though for a good chunk of the series we are following a character who kind of very proactively doesn't want to be alive, doesn't feel he deserves to be alive. And it very easily, without that very delicate balance of art style and presentation and character growth, and character presentation, it could very easily become just like very dour and a big downer, and maybe just as effective and just as well done, but it's not the same experience. And I think it takes a real master to be able to juggle all of these things into a story that honestly is like, I'm still somewhat in awe that this series got licensed and has been released in English by Kodansha.
In its entirety.
In its entirety, exactly. Like, the anime had a huge cult following, as I said, but it's not Attack on Titan. It's not like this is never going to be a popular, hit mainstream series. It wasn't ever functionally meant to be that. But the fact that, this series as an anime got 2 seasons and found great interest from the critical and kind of less mainstream outlets of anime fan. But then also, in response to that, I presume, Kodansha licensed the series and released it in singles. And, like, it's just, I don't know, it's amazing. It's crazy. And I'm very thankful. Thank you, Kodansha. Especially for, like, for something like Rakugo, which for a lot of anime fans and manga fans isn't, I mean, nowadays I think more people are aware of it. We have a Shonen Jump series about Rakugo right now, so, like, more people are aware of it, but it's not it's not a sports series or like an action adventure or something. Rakugo's a little bit, I look at it kind of like Karata and Shihai, another phenomenal series about a very specific Japanese art form / sport that is, like, almost totally unheard of outside of Japan. Nobody knows what that shit is, especially when the anime was coming out. I don't think many people were aware of what Rakugo was. So yeah, thank you, Kumota, for bringing awareness.
Also, I wanted to just, like, going back to her art for a second. Something that I think really contributes to the inherent warmth of the work is that, like, her audiences are never just, like, faceless NPCs. Like, you get the sort of lively and often raucous crowd that you would expect from Rakugo. And you see, like, the reactions from individual people in the audience. You see, like, how filled out the theater is on that day. You see the people who are, shouting out, like, oh my gosh, we were waiting for this. We're your huge fans. And because, Rakugo is usually performed in a pretty small, like, little theater, and it's possible for fans of it to call out to the performer with, like, comments and stuff. So, yeah, the series ultimately doesn't want you to understand Rakugo as a single performer lecturing to an audience, a faceless audience. And the art contributes to the idea that, no, this is a room full of people creating art together through mutual enjoyment of it. That is Descending Stories, Showa Genroku Rakugo Shinjuu.
Everyone go read it. Everyone go read it. Everyone go watch it. The other thing that the anime I think has the step up is that like it actually has the Rakugo performances, which are phenomenal. Just by the way, so if you read it, love it, go watch it because it's a fantastic adaptation. Isn't it Studio Dean? It's someone like it's not a studio that like is super hype right now. And Dean never truly was, but like this is a phenomenal series in all its iterations, and if you haven't read it or you've been on the fence about it, and we spoke a lot about spoilers, which is always going to happen in our series spotlight, so like sorry if you haven't if you've never tried it, but it is a series worth reading. I regard it as one of like the truly literary manga we have available, especially in English. And it's just,
and by that token, it's like I know a lot of people don't like spoilers, but for me it's like this series is not the kind of series that even by knowing every single plot beat before you go in, that it's going to be ruined. Like, these characters are so complex. Particularly its central character portrait that it's creating is so complex. We couldn't possibly like fit all of the complexities of this single character into our 2-hour discussion today. Like it's not, you know, the kind of art that's going to be ruined by knowing the twists and turns anyway. So which I don't think a lot of art is, but I understand that's a contentious point of view. So,
it's
but
not
certainly
like
not this one.
Yeah, it's not like we were discussing like a murder mystery here, right? Like
this is a story about a man who grows into an adult, gets old, and then dies.
And tells some stories along the way. But this is
and
truly...
he has a job. That's the story.
That's the story. But it truly is, as you said, like such a incredibly done character portrait. So intimately kind of explored, both internally with the character and externally from the surrounding and supporting characters. That it's something that's very... I can't think of too many other examples, especially in like manga, that are done quite as effectively and with such reverence to the human experience. All of these characters are very complicated people and all have their major issues, but it's never critical insofar as like, it's not a judgment of like you need to act a certain way to be valuable or for people to care about you. And
it's just like people are messy and they're complicated.
Exactly.
And they fuck up.
And we've all done that. And if you say you haven't, then you're a liar, is what that is. But it is phenomenally done if you care at all about kind of stories about art and artistic expression as well. I do think that if you care at all about like what manga can be and how, and character art, just like the extremely well done character writing in this needs to be experienced in some capacity. And I think, you know, when you're in a medium that is so full of like tropes and character like beats and specifications, and you get bogged down in like what is expected for manga, especially within certain demographics, it's hard or it can be easy to forget that, like, there's a depth of character that can be explored in comics regardless, but even within comics that are, a little bit outside of what is representative of the demographic and of, like, what manga is, especially within the Western perspective. I don't know. It's one of the good ones, you guys. And if you're listening to this podcast, I think hopefully you're one of the people who would be willing to try the series with an open mind, if nothing else. So do that if you haven't.
Read it. And if you speak Japanese, check out some Rakugo too. It's neat. Yep.
And on that note, we come to the conclusion of this wonderful spotlight of the ever fantastic Descending Stories, Showa Genroku Rakugo Shinjuu by Haruko Kumota. As mentioned, it's 10 volumes, completely released by Kodansha. I'm pretty sure it's still in print. And so jump on it whilst you have the opportunity. One of the few...
Quite the translation feat as well.
Yes.
Let's see if I can find the translator real quick. We've got a company listed here, Alt Japan Company Limited, with the names being Matt Travad, Hiroko Yoda, and Matt Alt. So, there you go.
So, yes, check it out. It's a lovingly done series with a kind of difficult subject matter, just insofar as, like, translating Rakugo. And one of the few, not only just one of the few josei series available in English, full stop, but certainly one of the few josei series that isn't focused on, I don't want to say a female character, because even outside of, like, trans perspective or potential there, it still has a lot of female influence there, and the female characters are very important to the series. But it's not, a lot of English josei is not a dramatic character introspection about the meaning and role of art within society. So it is wholly unique and well worth the read. On that note, next month we are, as always, at the end of the year, we will be doing our wrap-up of our favorite new debuts for 2022, or for the year. I'm sure we'll talk about some series that have ended as well as completed. I'm going to have to go and look at what I started reading this year, because this year's gone quickly and I don't remember anything about it. It's just been one of those COVID years.
And I, to be honest, haven't read that much, so I have a lot of catching up to do. There was, as you'll recall, a halfway around the world move halfway through my year, so a little bit behind.
Yeah, I mean, exactly. Between you moving, me moving, the world just still being all in a kerfuffle, the just sheer amount of manga that is released on every given day, and the sheer amount of, like, inaccessibility because printing schedules are still all screwed up. The paper shortages are just out of this world. I don't where. Yeah. It's been a time.
Yeah.
But regardless, if you have any questions or you want to give us your own new favorite debuts for the year, be sure to leave a comment on this specific video on my YouTube channel, Simply G, or hopefully if Twitter still maybe exists in a month, we don't know. This is post Musk era. We might be tweeting about it. If not, well, we're gonna have to figure something out.
Yep.
But otherwise, if you do have your questions or your lists, you will be able to find me on YouTube. Hopefully, you're either listening to this on YouTube, again, at Simply G, at the Simply G channel on YouTube, or on the multitude of podcasting platforms that this series is on, including Google Podcasts, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Anchor FM, Stitcher, I think. I don't know. There are lots of them. And be sure to follow Ray on all of her social medias, including her YouTube channel, Whimsical Pictures, and her Twitter. Again, we don't know how that's going to go, but it'll be linked in the description of this podcast regardless. So
I post a lot of Japanese musical theater actresses.
The most important content around, to be quite frank.
I think so.
So be sure to do that, and we'll catch you in the next episode. Bye till then.
Bye, guys.